Still people trickling in. Thanks, Randy, for starting that. And I'll start the summary. Oh, you did start it. That's amazing. Okay. I'd say let's begin. Welcome, everybody, to our May Cafe event, Systematically Designing Businesses Fit for the Future. This is now our 6th cafe event since the restart last November. It's pretty crazy that it's already been more than half a year in this new format. And it's very fitting for this somewhat important date that we have someone here who's been with this event series in all its shapes and forms from the very beginning. Anthony Upward will be here today and presenting, and most of you probably have seen him before, know him. I think if you've been engaged with anything that has flourishing in its name, it's very likely that Anthony was a co-founder. And that's also the case for the Strongly Sustainable Business Model Group, which was the original community out of which the FEI and the cafe originated. Anthony was also the first person when I came to Canada 5 years ago who received my email as I was looking for a group that engages systemically with sustainability, and who invited me to one of the SSBMG events. So Anthony, thank you again for that. I'm still here. Definitely a very important person for me personally also here in Canada. So we're really excited for today's session. Before we jump into the content and the session itself, as always, we'll do a land acknowledgement. And as I always say, we're all in many different places. I will do the land acknowledgement and speak it out loud for the city of Toronto, because that's where I'm situated right now. And I encourage you to think about the land that you are situated on. So we acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as always, at this point, I also want to encourage you to not just think of these land acknowledgements as you are in virtual or in-person meetings at the start of those meetings, but throughout your everyday lives to consider the land that you're upon. So that takes us to the agenda for today. And by now, if you've been with us a couple times before, you'll be familiar with the structure. We'll do a quick welcome that we're in the middle of and an icebreaker. We then have an hour for Anthony, who will be talking about how to design businesses fit for the future. We then have 15 minutes approximately for questions and prompts to you, so to get you engaged a little bit, where we want to ask you, if there was something that surprised you, something that stood out for you, anything that was disrupted or reinforced for you, and perhaps also how you'd like to challenge what you heard. So I want to just encourage you already at this point to kind of think of these questions as you hear the presentation, so we have a lively discussion afterwards. And then finally, Randy will share some FEI updates for this month before we close the session for today. So let me begin, for those that haven't been with us before, with a very, very quick introduction to the Flourishing Enterprise Institute. Just in case you don't know who you are with today. Well, I guess what stands out first is the word flourishing, and what does that mean to us? Essentially, we're all concerned with sustainability, but sustainability in its traditional sense talks mostly about the going on of a status quo, and flourishing is a still scientifically grounded vision that goes beyond that sustaining the status quo understanding of sustainability, and really tries to realize the full potential for individuals, communities, and ecosystems. So the FEI really is a research and innovation network that aims at stewarding enterprises that are capable of enhancing the well-being of their communities and wider ecosystems, so that are capable of flourishing and of facilitating flourishing for the communities they serve. The FEI was founded in 2019. It's housed at Varus at Wilfrid Laurier University and at OCAD in Toronto. We currently operate on funding that is granted to us by SSHRC and the Balsillie School of International Affairs. And we're, of course, always aiming to generate more funding opportunities, something that we've been doing frantically the last month, for example. So this is just a quick overview. We'll do a quick icebreaker also today. And if you've been with us the last few months, you have seen a lot of animals on screen for these icebreakers. Today, we'll do it a little bit differently. We just have one question for you. And, feel free to share in the chat. It's just one word. But even more than that, we'd love you to just speak up and share with us why you've chosen this word and what it means to you today. So the question for today is, which word best describes you today? That could be an adjective, it could be just an emotion, perhaps. Whatever stands out to you, whatever comes to you immediately, which word best describes you today? Feel free to share in the chat or to speak up. I can start. The word that came up for me when I thought about this question was refreshed, at least to a certain degree, because tonight was the first night in quite a few nights that I've actually gotten proper sleep, so I feel a little bit better today. Yeah, so that's the word for me today. Please go ahead and let us know which word best describes you today. So I see Anita shared in the chat. Hopeful. That's a good one. Nice to see some positive words in here. Resilient. That's great. Oh, Steph says her word was refreshed also. Oh, you managed to go outside this morning. I haven't been able to do that yet. So yeah, I could see that. Love a little bit of fresh air in the mornings just to wake you up. That's great to hear. Now it's always hard to be the first one that speaks up, but someone that wants to share can only be 5 seconds. Let us know which word best describes you. Randy, what about you? On fire. On fire. Let's hear it. Why are you on fire today?
One word, right? Just a bunch of
Yeah, I like that.
just a few really positive interactions and productive meetings. Feeling a good sense of flow.
I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you. No, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. You had a positive day so far. Kai says, also slightly optimistic thanks to attending a biomimetics conference before this call. That's great. You want to say a couple words about that, Kai? But don't want to call you out if you don't.
Sure, no, that's
okay.
Share. Anyone who knows me, I'm a biomimetic practitioner, very hard to get out there, very close in many things to regeneration, obviously, but seeing a conference always makes us feel more hopeful that we get it out there and into the systems as a design methodology. And so huddling together helps that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in all our work, probably the more we kind of think about things and work on things alone or just with a few people, it can feel like you're on an island, and the things you see out there don't really correspond with that. So I think it's always great to be at conferences and realize that there's a whole community, a whole ecosystem that works on the same thing, and it does make you feel hopeful. Yeah. Well, okay, thanks for sharing, everyone. Let's move on, I would say, and I will stop talking for now and stop my screen share. And we'll ask Anthony to please share his screen. Anthony, as I said, I mean, you see the logos already here. Anthony has been involved in many initiatives that I would say are part of our community. You've probably all seen the Flourishing Business Canvas, Flourishing Enterprise Strategy Design Method, co-founded Flourishing Startups, Flourishing Startup Method. again, a very integral person, a very integral part of our community. And so we're super happy to have you here, Anthony. And I'm sure you can introduce yourself much better yourself. So please go ahead. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you, Randy and Tim, for the invitation today. I'm really happy to be here. So I wasn't actually going to say too much about myself, but maybe you've prompted me to say a little something. So for those who don't know, I originated the Flourishing Business Canvas almost 15 years ago now. It's coming up to that anniversary. Between then and the end of 2022, we put it through an exhaustive testing process, which built a community around the world, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Yeah, I've been involved in that process ever since, and through that have met many wonderful people, including Randy and Tim, and got to do a lot of very interesting and exciting things with people all over the world. So that's enough, I think, about me. What do we? Let me just move that out of the way. So my objective today is to provoke interest and curiosity in this community that we're gathered here today as a community for flourishing enterprise, in the Flourishing Enterprise Innovation Toolkit. And as Tim has just elaborated, that includes the Canvas and then 2 methods for the effective use of the Canvas. And it's the methods that we'll spend most of the time on today. And I also want to open door to possibilities with all of you. So I'm interested in collaborations, interested in working with other people on research, working with other people on education, and probably other topics as well. So if there's something that you would like to suggest, then either do so during the Q&A or you can contact me at the end. So the agenda for my part of the meeting is I've got an introduction to the Flourishing Business Canvas for those people who haven't seen it before. That'll take a little less than 20 minutes. We'll then have a Q&A about the Canvas, if you have questions about the Canvas specifically. And then we're going to get into the meat of the topic today about how do you design future fit enterprises. And we're going to talk about specifically the Flourishing Enterprise Strategy Design Method, although I will touch on the Flourishing Startup Method as well. And then we'll have a second round of Q&A at the end, which can cover any topic that you like. Hopefully that's okay. So Tim has already said this, but I'll say it in my own way here. Why do we say flourishing and not sustainability? Our feeling is that on that spectrum that's scientifically defined by the positive psychologists, they have death at one end, or mass extinction if we're talking about humanity as a whole, and at the other end they have flourishing. And what we've observed is that when you look at the definition of sustainable development is very much, as Tim said, trying to figure out how do we sustain what we've got and the way we are, rather than aiming for something much more positive, rather than aiming for what's as good as we could be. And so we want to focus on being as good as we could be, and hence our choice to use the word flourishing rather than sustainability. So introducing the Flourishing Business Canvas. So for those of you who haven't been around business models very much, the way we used to think about business models was very much the same way that we thought about sustainable development, which is at the intersection of society, the environment, and the economy, and that somehow sustainable development occurs at the intersection of those 3 things. But business models were very firmly in the economic dimension, in the economic circle. And the way that people used to describe business models is that they are things that describe the rationale of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value. And although it's not said, they mean value financially, and that's the only dimension of value that they are concerned about. So that definition's from Alex Osterwalder and Yves Pigneur back in 2008. The old paradigm was the business model canvas. For those of you who know it, this is a tool that again was produced by Alex Osterwalder and Yves Pigneur back in 2008. And as I just mentioned, it's really measuring success only from a financial standpoint, and it has these 9 questions that you respond to. Oops. And then the other thing that's completely missing from here is the social and the environmental. It really is purely financial. So you can't even really start to think about sustainable development, let alone flourishing with the business model canvas. So what we've done is we've rethought business models, and what we've first of all done is taken a scientific approach to this. So we've now understood that the economy is something that's created by society in order to help society's members better meet their needs, and that society is ultimately and intimately and in the moment entirely dependent on a healthy, flourishing environment for the health and well-being of society. So this is a nest. The smaller circles dependent on the larger circles, and this is a model that a natural scientist would recognize, you know, a physicist or a chemist or a biologist, or goodness, I've lost my language here. But this is probably not something that most economists would recognize. Most economists would just focus on the economy and somehow believe that it's entirely separate from society and the environment, which is a problem, but a problem for discussion on another day. So what we've observed is that flourishing happens across all three of these systems. It's not something that can happen independently. And what we've now said about our business models is, yes, they're still economic, but because the economy is part of society and society is dependent upon the environment, the business model now has to include those other dimensions. And so the new definition of what a business model is that it is a description of how an enterprise defines and achieves success over time. It's both the story of that business and it's the numbers about that business. And what we want to try and do is think about organizations that are socially beneficial, environmentally regenerative, and financially viable. And this definition comes from a paper that myself and one of the other co-founders of the SSBMG, Peter Jones, wrote together back in 2016. So if we now look at 21st century enterprises and start to think about, well, how do we help them design business models that are socially beneficial, environmentally regenerative, and financially viable? When you survey the tools out there, the tools just don't exist or haven't existed. The business model canvas, as I just mentioned, really just focuses on the financial, and there's very little else out there. So one of the things that we started to think about quite a long time ago was, what do those tools need to contain? What do they need to look like? What attributes do they need to have? So the first thing is that we need to embed all the knowledge necessary to describe and design a business model based on any combination of enterprise goals and stakeholders. So we want to be able to describe a business that is purely profit driven, because that's probably the way a lot of businesses are today. But we also need to be able to describe a business that's in the future going to be flourishing, that's going to be socially beneficial, environmentally regenerative, and financially viable. And we need to look at this from any combination of stakeholders, or some people would say rights holders. And we need to do that from a social, environmental, and economic perspective. We need to make this knowledge accessible by some sort of a shared language. So the tool is there to promote discussion amongst people involved in the business, amongst the stakeholders. So we need to the tool needs to provide a shared language to facilitate those discussions. It's got to be able to describe the present and design multiple futures, as I've mentioned. And it's got to enable collaborative meaning and decision-making despite its complexity. So if it doesn't facilitate people learning about their business model or learning about their future business model, it's not going to work. And last but not least, it's got to be visual and attractive. And if it's not clear, this is a very challenging design brief to try and come up with a tool that meets all of those requirements. So our proposal to meet those requirements is the Flourishing Business Canvas. It's at its basic level a tool that provides a common language in a useful visual framework that enables you to collaboratively sketch, prototype, design, improve, understand, measure, diagnose, and probably most importantly, tell stories about any business model, socially, environmentally, and economically, present business models or future business models, words, and numbers. And it was based on 3 years of well-cited peer review research and 10 years of practice with entrepreneurs and business leaders around the world. And it significantly extends using a systems lens, Alex Osterwalder's original research and practice. So Alex is still the giant on whose shoulders I'm very much standing, but we've reached for the sky. So our approach is holistic. So what we are suggesting people do is that they design their business model considering all sources of opportunity and material risk. So we're not saying that this is a sustainability canvas. We're not saying that this is a financial canvas. We're saying this is a flourishing canvas that integrates all the potential sources of opportunity and risk that are relevant to all your stakeholders. So we're saying no longer is it necessary, is acceptable just to think about customers or just to think about investors. Now we've got to think about all the stakeholders. And we believe that by doing that, we increase the possibility to achieve all the stakeholders' goals effectively, efficiently, reliably, and gracefully. So here is the canvas, a language for future fit enterprise design. It's got 17 questions, which we are claiming are necessary and sufficient to describe any business model, socially, environmentally, and financially, story and numbers, present or future. So let me just walk you through the structure of the canvas very briefly, just to give you a sense of how it works. The first is that nested set of systems that you saw in circles a moment ago is represented on the canvas directly as 3 boxes, in this case, environment, society, and then economy, which means when you're responding to questions that are inside the economics context, you are by definition also responding from a social and environmental perspective, since the economy is inside society, which is dependent upon the environment. You'll notice some of the boxes only overlap the environment. So those are things that don't have a social or economic dimension. And you'll notice some boxes overlap all 3, indicating that there's some possible combinations that you might need to think about. The next thing we've done is we've broken the canvas up into 4 perspectives, and that's because 17 is a big number and we wanted to be able to group things together to make it a little bit more manageable. The 4 perspectives relate to the 4 key question words. So people is the who dimension, the value perspective is the what of your business, the process perspective is the how and the where you do it, and the outcomes perspective is the why of the business. And then we have the 17 questions. So for those of you who've never used a canvas before, the idea is that you take one of those boxes, such as stakeholders, and you turn that into a question. Who are my stakeholders? And then you respond to that question by placing sticky notes, either physically or electronically, into the stakeholder box to describe who your stakeholders are. Same with value co-creations. What value are you co-creating with your stakeholders in order to better meet their needs, and so on. So you just take each box and turn it into a question. One of the things we did do is ensure some compatibility with the old way of thinking. So these are the 9 boxes that appeared on with the $ in, that appeared on the business model canvas. So one of the things you can do is you can take a business model that has been built using the business model canvas, and you can move those post-it notes onto the Flourishing Business Canvas, and the post-it notes will all still make sense. So as an example, the business model canvas doesn't have stakeholders, it has customer segments. But one of your most important stakeholders is customers. So when you move your customer sticky from the business model canvas to the Flourishing Business Canvas, it still makes sense. And the same is true for all of the other 9 questions that the business model canvas asks. And this is actually an exercise that we do in workshops for people who are familiar with the BMC. We ask them to bring a completed BMC with them. We ask them to move the stickies onto the Flourishing Business Canvas. And then we spend time exploring what new things they see because of the improved contexts and perspectives that the Flourishing Business Canvas provides. So key benefits of the Flourishing Business Canvas: it's a common language for describing and designing flourishing enterprises, fit for the very different futures we know that are coming, and fit for any combination of stakeholders and their goals. It builds an understanding of interconnections, the enterprise with society, the environment, and the economy. It enables broader, deeper, and richer conversations about all aspects of value co-creation and co-destruction. And it provides context to enable stakeholder collaboration around their shared goals informed by their values. So this is absolutely critical, that we understand that goals come from people's values as well as what's scientifically necessary. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to talk about the method. And so when you share your goals and you explain your values, that enables stakeholders to gain alignment on key strategic decisions when starting an enterprise or transforming an existing business. And as I've mentioned, it does support earlier practices, including the BMC, and for those of you who know it, Lean Startup and Customer Development are also supported by the Flourishing Business Canvas. So just a few words about where we are in the development and rollout of the Flourishing Business Canvas. So it's been tested, it was tested over 10 years by 320 individuals and organizations, and I'll mention a few of those in a moment. We now have activity in 75 countries around the world. In the last 12 months, it's been downloaded over 5,000 times. It's available in 8 languages now, with another 4 in the works. The last 2 we added were German and Arabic. It's in use by thousands of entrepreneurs and business leaders around the world. We have 500 people in our online community, with more joining every day. And there are 5 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters that have been created around the Canvas. So a couple of examples of where it's been used. So the National Innovation Agency of Norway, Innovation Norway, is standardizing on the Flourishing Business Canvas for business modeling with startups and established businesses. So they're phasing out the business model canvas and replacing it with the FBC. GC NODA, which is an innovation cluster in southern Norway, we developed with them, and Randy was involved in this, a strategy development program that uses the Flourishing Business Canvas, and over 20 CEO teams, C-level teams, C-suite teams have attended that program. The Pan-European Climate Change Initiative, EIT Climate Change, developed an e-learning course on sustainable business modeling using the Flourishing Business Canvas. We would have loved them to call it Flourishing Business Modeling, but they chose sustainable. And lots of people have now been through that e-learning course and they continue to do so. In Canada, District 3, which is the accelerator of Concordia University, have put hundreds of entrepreneurs through their programming using the Flourishing Business Canvas to help with the early stages of the startups. And one of our most recent successes has been with a travel and tourism consulting company in Ottawa, Canada. And what they've done is developed a strategy service for specifically tailored for tourism businesses and organizations that enables those businesses and organizations to develop strategy, again, using the Flourishing Business Canvas. And the methodology that that service uses is the methodology that I'll be talking about in just a moment. Okay, so I'm going to stop at that point. I'll stop sharing for a moment and take questions on the Canvas. I know some of you here are already pretty familiar with this, so this might be a pretty quick Q&A, but I wanted to give the opportunity for people to ask any questions that they have about the Canvas or its use.
I have a quick question, Anthony, that just came up for me. When you said the kind of compatibility with the original business modeling canvas, and that there's even an exercise of kind of transferring the stickies and then transferring them back and trying to see what was added through considering the Flourishing Business Canvas. Is that something you actually encourage also to maybe get businesses to open up to the Flourishing Business Canvas? That's a good starting point, the more traditional business modeling canvas?
The short answer is no. So when people are familiar with the business model canvas and they've arrived at the Flourishing Business Canvas from that perspective, it can be useful to explain what I explained to you all just a moment ago. But it's although the business model canvas is very popular, the vast majority of people that we meet have never heard of it, and so there's absolutely no value in taking them through that earlier tool. It just basically leads people to think that, you know, I call the business model canvas a dangerous oversimplification now, based on what we know and based on a systems perspective.
Right. Thanks, Anthony. Gani, I see your hand up.
Yeah, maybe to complement the answer of Anthony from practical perspective, what I used to do is to, for those who know the original or the traditional canvas, I simply put both of them on the screen or on the paper, and then simply make them reflect on what is missing on the traditional. So instead of putting them in a learning curve, I try to unlearn what they are already doing. So from a cognitive perspective, from pedagogical perspective, it's absolutely a powerful tool I mean, they will themselves recognize all the missing parts, and then they will simply flush between brackets, with all respect to our colleagues, of course. They will just like stop using the narrative of the traditional business model and adopt by themselves the narrative of the Flourishing Business Canvas. My 2 cents.
Josh.
Thanks. I'm wondering, Anthony, if there's organizations in certain sectors that you've identified, like if you've identified any patterns about organizations more likely to adopt or refute, or any kind of trends you've noticed in different sectors.
I don't think we're at a scale to be able to identify trends like that at this point. For example, tourism, it was entirely by happenstance that that particular organization and that particular industry got pretty interested in the canvas early on. But I don't think that that's necessarily indicative that it's best suited for tourism, or that other sectors won't find it more useful than tourism finds it, for example. So yeah, I think we're probably a little early to be able to spot trends like that.
Thanks.
Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. It's I'm familiar with the ongoing development, but it's still great to hear it, and I gain nuance every time I hear about it. Two questions. One of them might fall into the kind of quibble category, which is the use of the word flourishing really sort of goes back to Ehrenfeld's sustainability as flourishing. And I really appreciated the sort of the bridging of terminology that provided. And when you framed it up today, you sort of separated them out. And I might quibble a little bit with sort of that framing, but I'm actually more interested in just hearing why you do that framing. So that's sort of question number one. And then the second question is sort of, we've had ongoing conversations about this, and in particular with FEI moving further and further into the space of context or thresholds-based sustainability. The last that I had heard, the Flourishing Business Canvas was looking into the ability to integrate thresholds and hadn't done so yet. And I'm assuming that that's sort of still a work in development, but I'd love to hear where things stand on that front.
So I didn't frame it up the way that I frequently, and you've heard me do in the past today, simply for matters of time.
Okay, great.
So I went back to the positive psychology definition, which actually predates Ehrenfeld by nearly 10 years. Typically what I'll say these days is and I was contrasting sustainable development, to be specific, rather than sustainability. I mean, I put that up as the headline on the slide, but it was very much sustainable development that I was critiquing. And so these days I say sustainable flourishing as a complement to that. And I've got some blog posts on our website that unpack that in some detail and highlight the problems with sustainable development.
Thank you for that clarification, and I understand that nuance. And just to comment very briefly here, the concern that I raise is that there's this. I've been addressing this in the regenerative space, where it's sort of like, well, regenerative is better than sustainability, and it always sort of makes me a little worried. I mean, yes, regenerative in a pure definition is better than sustainability in its sort of diluted form, but we're moving quickly towards regenerative in a diluted definition where and ultimately they're interdependent, I guess I would say. So that's the only thing that I'm trying to flag here, is that we not get into sort of definitional wars, but rather build definitional bridges. But thanks.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, Bill. I mean, typically that I'll say that flourishing requires regeneration.
Yes,
is typically the way that I'll put it. But sometimes I'll say that flourishing and regeneration are synonyms. Yep. to build that big inclusive tent. On to your second question about context-based matters. So the environmental context in the canvas and the social context in the canvas is meant to imply context. They are the contexts. And so the thinking that says that we should be asking questions about those contexts in order to determine whether or not a business is sustainable flourishing, is baked right into the very design of the canvas. Now, operationalizing it in practical terms, like taking the UN SDPIs and comparing those against a flourishing business model design, where an actual future design of a business model is being described using the canvas, that we have not yet had an opportunity to do. Up to this point, we've been using the Future Fit Business Benchmark, which is not, I would say, directly context-based. It's implied, but it's not direct. And we do that because the the Future Fit Business Benchmark has a complete coverage on all the topics, environmental and social, which the UN SDPIs don't yet have. So that's a practical matter. So we have got some experience using the benchmark, the Future Fit Business Benchmark.
Thanks, Anthony.
Okay.
Very helpful.
Yeah, more work to be done, and keep pushing us.
So Anthony, just quickly, we have a bunch of other questions in the chat.
Okay.
I'll leave it up to you if you'd prefer to answer them now. I've also collected them, so we could address them at the end of your presentation, whatever you think is best. Just wanted to flag that to you.
So yeah, I'll take these now. So any larger business examples? The short answer to that is no. We don't have that I'm aware of. Now, we've got a pretty large network of people using it now, so it could well be that it is being used out there, but personally, I'm not aware of an example. One thing I will say is if you have a large multinational, I would definitely not use the canvas at the macro level, at the top level of that integrated business. I would use it down at the business unit level. Who's typically in the room to fill the canvas? The ideal answer to that is a good cross-section of your stakeholders. So you want to have in the room a customer, you want to have an employee, you want to have an investor, you want to have somebody from your supply chain, and you want to be filling that out together, and members of senior management as well. Practically, most companies don't feel very comfortable doing that the first time they use the canvas. So practically, it's usually members of the senior management team who are using it together, but it's definitely something you can't do by yourself. It's something you have to do in collaboration. What are the next steps after the canvas has been completed? So first of all, the canvas is never completed because it evolves over time as you learn. And one of the things that you do after you've created an iteration of the canvas is you go out and you try and validate it, because when you're doing design work, all the stickies you put on a canvas are just hypotheses. You don't know that they're valid until you go out and get evidence that they're valid or invalid. And then you can, based on that learning, you come back to the canvas and you update it with better stickies that are more representative of the way that the world actually works. This is a very big question, and that's a very short answer to it. So recognize there's a lot more I could say there. How do you qualify thriving? I would also, yes, say that that's a synonym to flourishing, very much. I think possibly there's some technical, like with regeneration, I think there's some probably technical differences you could have a discussion about, but it's basically it's a synonym. How would you suggest leaders engage their customers? So the experience that I've had is that when you go to a customer and you say, we're working on improving our business model in order that we can fulfill this purpose, so a why or a vision statement, and we'd like your help with that. Generally speaking, customers are quite keen to get involved because they recognize that if the organization that's trying to improve gets better, they as a customer will get better service. And there's similar arguments you can make with most other stakeholders that bringing people inside for these types of discussions can be quite powerful and useful for them. Again, a short answer to a long question. What's some of the pre-work or pre-learning folk needs to do to usually engage in this process? I think that the short answer to that is none at all. We do workshops where I barely give even the introduction I've given you we just start using it. And what we found is that people can sense make the canvas pretty easily. They won't have a technically correct understanding of it. They won't have a technically complete understanding of it, but they can get value out of it just because of the questions that it's asking and getting them to reflect on those questions. That's actually valuable. When you're using it in a more structured way over a longer period of time, then we have to remember that the canvas is merely a vehicle for summarizing all the research and work that you're doing. So if you take biophysical stocks, for example, most people don't know what those are to start with. Once they understand that it's everything on the planet from which you take your resources and from which your resources go back to at the end of their life, once they understand that, they realize that they actually have no idea where their raw materials are coming from very often, that they haven't ever gone down their supply chain all the way to the origins. And so there's research to be done there, and there's documentation to be prepared and things like that. Similarly, on products and services and sustainability in general, people might want to do a life cycle analysis, and that's a big piece of work, again, which you would probably end up summarizing on the canvas. Similarly, the costs and benefits, even financially, you want to probably have some spreadsheets behind that. If you're using a measurement system like UNSDPI's or the Future Fit Business Benchmark, then you're going to have do independent work off the canvas, which you then summarize on the canvas with those tools as well. So of course you can invest a lot of time learning about it before you use it if you want to, but it's certainly not been our experience that that's required to get value out of it. Short answer to that question, Randy, I would say the answer is no. I'm not aware of examples of that yet.
I was particularly curious, we contemplated the applicability of the canvas within a municipal setting. And for exactly the reason you mentioned, like there's no way possible you could conceive of transplanting the entire scope of what a municipality does onto a single canvas. So I wondered about the possibility, whether in a business or a municipality, of having multiple canvases per unit and then somehow making sense of that at an overall or cross-organizational scale. Be interesting to see what that could look like.
So one of the things that we want to do and we haven't had a chance to do yet is something called collaborative business modeling, and that's where you get multiple organizations or multiple parts of an organization into a room at the same time, and the parts on the left and right of the canvas are shared by all businesses, all organizations. And so you'd have those once in the room, and then you'd just have the center part of the canvas for each of the business units or each of the parts of the municipality. And they all would have to refer to the actors, who would be citizens largely, and biophysical stocks, which would be the land that the municipality occupies, as shared resources that all of the parts of the municipality have to talk to. And that's where you start to get some of the systems level integration.
So this is one of those moments that I can't help but take advantage of as an organizer of many of these events and relationships. I imagine what you're describing is perhaps a step or an area you might explore further through your collaboration with Evolute 6.
Yes.
So Evolute 6 is focused on this idea of a more collective orientation, recognizing that we can't achieve sustainability as individual organizations, but there's a necessity to work in a cooperative manner in a very simple way. That's how I describe it. So they talk about this concept of a fair share commons as an approach for essentially establishing the governance that would be necessary to empower many different actors to essentially commit to this more collective way of operating. It's quite sophisticated. It's extremely advanced. I recommend taking a look at Evolute 6's stuff. And for what it's worth, we're hosting a session with Evolute 6, our next cafe in July. We'll feature them in case you're interested. It's not quite up yet, but we'll be up by the time we get to the next week or two for registration in case you're interested. Yeah, the work they're doing in terms of this sort of more collective orientation, understanding that we need to make change at an enterprise scale, but that multiple enterprises need to work together in order to enable the outcomes that we're trying to produce is super interesting. Anyway, thanks for that. And I think this also points to the question maybe a little bit about stakeholders and what stakeholders mean and how they may be treated inside of a view of the canvas and what it is to transition towards flourishing.
Absolutely. Great points. Thank you for that, Randy. So I'm going to move on now to the second part of my presentation, which is starting from the perspective of why is the canvas by itself not sufficient? Why do we need a toolkit? And it's very simple. The analogy is exactly the same as real tools, hammer screwdrivers. They're all great things, but they're not really very useful if you don't have related and complementary tools, a nail set, a countersink drill. They're not very useful. Tools are not very useful unless you have methods, knowledge of how to use them. For example, how to build a chair. They're not very useful if you don't have design principles, knowledge of what the ideal results look like. They're not very useful unless you have some patterns, generalized examples of ideal results. You know, what are other chairs that have been successful in the past? And you also need case studies of what's the best possible results today. So, and we also need to note that tools are tangible and social technologies. So it's not just the, or in the case of the canvas, the intangible, they're intangible and social, that they have a human dimension to them that brings them alive. It's not until you have the social aspect of the tool use that it becomes really useful. So our conclusion about this is that to enable leaders to co-design their enterprise's business model, we need a comprehensive toolkit of tools and methods for innovating towards sustainable flourishing. And that's what the toolkit is all about. So it's for all organization leaders and innovators. So it starts off with the science and the ethics, the best that we have available. It adds deep human indigenous wisdoms, and that's the background. That's the basis for the toolkit. In the toolkit, we have tools like the Flourishing Business Canvas. We have design principles like the Future Fit design principles and UN SDPIs as those get more complete. We have the dance steps, the method, in other words, for how to effectively use the canvas with those design principles. And then we have patterns and case studies in order to give examples. So we think that this is a toolkit that as we develop it further, will enable leaders to close their innovation gaps to sustainable flourishing, recognizing, you know, if they've only been thinking up to the middle of that sustainable versus flourishing continuum, at this point, there's going to be a lot of innovation that's going to be required to move them to the right-hand side, the flourishing side. I didn't mention this earlier, but the canvas is available under a Creative Commons license, and it doesn't have any commercial restrictions on it, so anybody can go and download it and use it however they want. If you want to make changes to it, though, we ask that you come and talk to us first. So there's a no derivatives limitation on that license. So currently what's in the toolkit is one tool, the canvas, and two methods. There's a method, the Flourishing Enterprise Strategy Design method, for designing new strategies for existing businesses to realize sustainable flourishing over time, and for startups, for the design of enterprises' initial business models with a view to ultimately realizing sustainable flourishing over time. We have the Flourishing Startups method. In the future, we've got a whole bunch of things that we'd like to work on, and this is based on time and funding, or funding and time, that we would get to work on these to add these additional items to the toolkit. So now I want to step back and talk about one of these, the methodologies that we do have in the toolkit already. And I want to just review quickly, how did we go about doing planning and strategy historically? And the short answer to that question is we did forecasting. So in forecasting, we're trying to balance two things. We want to realize some near-term goals, so 12 months away, 36 months away, maybe 5 years away. And we've got to figure out how we're going to continue to survive today in order to be able to reach those near-term goals. And when you do this type of business modeling, this type of forecasting, you end up with one business model, which we call your next business model, which is the one that you're aiming to move your organization towards. So you're going to make your operation be as per the business model design in your next business model. And that integrates how you're going to do both meet your near-term goals and survive today. So the established process for forecasting, just to remind everybody, you use the past to create projections of likely near-term futures, and long-term outcomes, they just happen. So there's no intentionality about the long-term with forecasting. because you're just going to keep looking backwards and project forwards. So this really isn't useful if we want to be intentional about enabling the possibility of flourishing or future fitness. So how does it work? Forecasting work? You start by looking into the past, you review the past, you do research of how the past is influencing the present. You then project forward and you undertake some business planning work to develop and commit to realizing a strategy and the next business model based on this analysis. And then you repeat that, and then the long-term outcomes, as I mentioned, just happen. And over time, you iterate that forecasting process and you end up wherever you end up. There's no intentionality about the longer term. So we think if you want to be intentional about creating the possibility for flourishing, we really have to, first of all, think about how do we change the goals that we set? How do we change the way we set the goals for enterprises? So, and I need to give full credit to Dr. Bob Willard for this slide. So the way that we typically have set goals is we've been looking backwards into the unsustainable past and forwards into the flourishing future. And we look at your current state and we do forecasting. So we look at your state in a baseline year and we compare that to the current state. And then you create some self-defined short-term goals. We're going to have 10% more sales in the next 3 years. We're going to reduce our water consumption by 5%. We're going to increase the number of customers we have by 50, whatever the short-term goals that you think are important in order to realize your strategy. Often people will also compare themselves to competitors and the goals that competitors have set, and that it can also influence what the self-defined short-term goals are like. And last but not least, and I need to give Bill some credit for this, there's for introducing this. I know he's not the originator of it, and I forget who it is that is the originator of this term. Sometimes people will actually choose predatory delay goals. In other words, goals that actually are trying to take us back into the unsustainable past. And there are a number of industries that are guilty of doing that right now. So this is all very interesting, but it doesn't really help us if we're trying to get to the flourishing future. Again, this is forecasting those self-defined short-term goals. We'll just repeat this process as we move forward in time, but we won't end up in any particular destination. So that means we need to have a definition of the future. There's lots of ways of saying this, but one way of saying what we want is a post-growth, inclusive, just, flourishing economy and society, and environment as well, of course. And what we define that on is best current knowledge. And then within that context, within that understanding of the economy, society, and the environment, you then set up what your purpose is going to be for your organization. And one purpose you could adopt is to become future fit. To be future fit in that flourishing future. So if you're now going to set goals against that far future, forecasting doesn't really help you very much to figure out what that journey is going to look like, because forecasting is just projecting forward the recent past. We're now looking into the far future. How can we go about doing that? So before I get on to the methodology, I also want to make a note about constraints. So some people will say, how can I constrain my future based on science or based on ethics or based on deep indigenous wisdoms? And what we've noted is that, in fact, it's an unlimited amount of creativity that can be unleashed by actually constraining your future. So if you think about an artist, if you gave an artist, if there's no frame around the canvas, there's no edge to the canvas, the painter can't paint. If there isn't a size to the piece of marble, then the sculptor can't sculpt. If there's no size to the piece of clay that a potter's going to make a pot from, again, you can't start to work. You have to have some creative constraints. And so our belief is that using those design principles as creative constraints based on their values, it actually unleashes a lot of creativity that we don't get when we do forecasting. And the other important point about constraining our future stories by principles informed by scientific knowledge and our values and deep indigenous wisdoms, if we don't do that, our future business models designs won't be possible, likely, nor desirable, and they're going to be full of unintended consequences for ourselves and others. And if you think about what forecasting has led us to, you'll see that that's exactly what forecasting has done. So what are the requirements for a new approach to a new methodology for planning if forecasting isn't going to cut it? And how is that method going to include this idea of creative constraints of the far future? So now we've got a bigger problem on our hands. We've got actually three things that we've got to balance. So this is a three-way tug of war now. So the first thing is, now we've got to realize long-term purposes. We're trying over time to become flourishing. But the problem with this is that if you've got to focus your organization on those long-term purposes. But if you only focus on those long-term purposes, you're never going to survive to create those outcomes in the long term. Secondly, you've got to survive today. And you've got to be sufficiently viable today. But if you only focus on that, you're never going to contribute to realizing your long-term purposes. And last but not least, you've got to do no harm on the journey from the present to your far future vision of what flourishing. So you've got to ensure that how you realize your purpose and how you survive today actually doesn't make the situation that we're in worse. And what the business modeling does is you now have multiple business models, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And those integrate how you intend to do all three of these things at the same time. So what are the requirements for a new strategy and planning approach? The first thing is we've got to be able to deal with all three of those dimensions. We also need an approach that starts with the end in mind and proactively explores what a feasible long-term future looks like. And that's very different from forecasting, which is near-term and incremental. We now have science-informed descriptions of what's feasible and hence creative constraints on long-term enterprise purposes and associated goals. So we actually, if we could find a method for using these creative constraints, then we would have a good way of approaching things. And we also need a method that doesn't only look at the long term. We also need a method that proactively moves us towards those long-term goals, yes, but does so while considering how are we going to survive in the near term and also doing no harm. So that the methodology needs to have this tension in it between the far future and the near term. And as I've said several times, this is very different from traditional forecasting. So the name of the new methodology that we're proposing, and again, we didn't originate this. This is done originally by John Robinson, University of Toronto professor back in the 1980s, ironically for the energy industry. And then it was up, but that was backcasting itself. And then against the science-based design principles or science-based constraints, that idea was introduced by the not-for-profit, global not-for-profit, The Natural Step, in the early 1990s, early to mid-1990s. So what does the backcasting against science-based principles look like? So again, you've got the present, the near future, and the far future. It's this process, we label it the steps of this process ABCD, just to give us something to ground in. You start by, and this is iterative, so we recognize that over time, you're going to get better at doing this process. You're going to actually improve your capability of doing strategy over time as you iterate through the ABCD steps. So the first thing is you start with your inspiring vision, where you appreciate and define what success means for you. And we're going to creatively constrain that definition of success by your purpose and also by science-based future fit design principles, as well as the ethics and wisdom and deep indigenous wisdoms. I've just omitted that from the slide, but it's implied that they're part of the design principles. Then you come back to the present and you understand where you are. How does the current state compare to that inspiring vision? Once you've done that, you can then start to think about what are the solutions, what innovations are going to be required to move me from the present to that inspiring vision of success. And once you've got those solutions in mind, you can then start to make some choices. And those choices will take you on a journey. This is multiple iterations now. So the first iteration is to the first blue dot, the second iteration is to the second blue dot, third iteration is to the third blue dot. And the idea is that those solutions that you've identified, not all of them are going to be useful or relevant. So you pick a combination of solutions which you bake into your next business model. And that business model describes both how you're going to be moving towards the inspiring vision and how you're going to remain viable in the near term. And the way you do the selection of which options you're going to take is through 4 prioritizing questions. The first is, does that idea, does that solution, does that innovation item, does that business model, does it align with the values that the organization has put forward that are baked into your purpose? Does it provide a solution that moves us towards that inspiring vision, the right direction, in other words? Is it a solution that provides you with a flexible platform? The future is ultimately unknowable, so you need to be able to, you want to create possibility as you move into the future rather than narrowing things down. And the last but not least is it a good return on investment in the near term? That's the idea that you've got to remain viable in the short term. And the references to that is down in the bottom. So we have 2 methods that we've built based on backcasting against science-based principles in the toolkit. And as I said, they're based on the ABCD method and constrained by the future fit design principles. The first method is the Flourishing Enterprise Strategy Design method. This has been published in a book called Rethinking Strategic Management. This book is very interesting in a number of different respects. The first of which is that the introductory chapter by the editor is the only place we know so far where somebody has said that the practice of strategy, of defining strategies, the management practice of defining strategy, must be constrained by the context, must be constrained by planetary boundaries, by the donut, and starts to talk about how you go about doing the constraining process. And the rest of the book is examples of how different people have gone about doing that and case studies. And that's where our chapter fits in, my chapter with my colleague, Stephen Davis, who originated the method with me. There's obviously a book chapter is a book chapter, so you've actually got to take the words on the page and make them real. So there's been a range of approaches to implementing the method in practice by various community leaders in our community, and I've mentioned a couple of those in the examples earlier on. The second one, which we're not going to talk about very much today, is the method for startups, and this was based, in addition to the ABCD method and backcasting, it was also based on the lean startup approach. So for those of you who know, that became very popular about 12 years ago now as a way of accelerating the development of startups and optimizing the amount of time and effort that it takes to start new organizations. We've got works in progress to publish this, but we already have a Flourishing Entrepreneurship Accelerator micro-certified education program by one of our community leaders, which is a company called Flourishing Startups, of which I'm a co-founder. So here's another way of looking at the ABCD steps. I wasn't going to go into this in any great detail, but you'll notice that the business modeling tasks are the same, whether or not you're describing your existing business model or designing your future one. First is to determine your stakeholders, to all the questions you were asking about stakeholders. Then you establish what the governance rights are of those stakeholders. You set goals based on the purpose. You develop value propositions, both positive and negative. You ascertain the processes that you need in order to deliver those value propositions, and then you agree on the measures to determine whether or not you're successfully realizing your goals. The Flourishing Startups method is absolutely not a linear process. It's very iterative. Within each iteration, it is iterative. And so the ABCD steps are used in various different ways. And I won't go into any more detail about this. I'll give you an invitation at the end if you want to learn more about the Flourishing Startups method. So in terms of the method's use around the world, I mentioned this already, the 20 small and medium enterprise CXO teams developed their strategy using a 4-day workshop. We've got 4 not-for-profit CXO teams in tourism to develop their strategy over a 3-month engagement using the method. And we're currently looking for our next opportunities to further test and refine. So we've got template plans for a 3-month engagement, for a 4-day design lab, and an 8-week online delivery. For Flourishing Startups, it's been embedded in programming for 25 startup programs and for a number of incubators and accelerators in Canada. and thousands of entrepreneurs have benefited. And as I mentioned, we've now got this micro-certified Train the Trainer course for coaches and entrepreneurial programmers, which is now, we've actually literally today finished our 3rd cohort in that, and we've got 40 coaches that have been certified to date. And I'll stop at that point and take some more questions. So a very brief introduction to the method and the rationale behind why we need it.
Bernard, would you like to ask your question yourself? You put one in the chat just a couple of minutes ago.
Sure, hang on just a sec. I'm coming back to the canvas itself. So my question, is there a place or a moment in the canvas when new value creation opportunities are identified, opportunities that really are at the intersection of what the business's strengths are, where they can make a reasonable return on investment, and most importantly, an opportunity that, if realized, builds a better world?
So I'll actually respond to this through the perspective of the method.
Okay.
So when you come up with your Inspiring Future Vision business model in step A, this is exactly what you're doing. You're trying to imagine a world in which you're going to be generating net benefit, hopefully actually actual total benefits, so no negative impacts at all. And so in order to do that, you've got to answer the question, what is the value co-creations that you need in order to meet the needs of the stakeholders that those stakeholders are going to have in that future? So that's absolutely central to the way you set up the present. Then when you come back to the present, you describe the way things are. Then when you look at the step C and look at creating solutions to close the gap, you're looking now at what do you need to do, what innovations are required in order that you can move your business from the way it is today in the current context into its far future view in the future context. So again, you're going to be having to answer the question, how do I stay viable in the near term, as well as how do I make material progress towards the long term? So again, you're absolutely, and hopefully on the journey, you're improving your profitability, you're improving your ROI on that journey as you go. So absolutely, the process is designed to seek out those intersections. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So Anthony, perhaps a slightly related point that I was curious about, which I think we've spoken about before, but maybe you could just outline your thinking on it briefly again here. Of course, we always deal with this tension of trying to create a better world and dealing with organizations that either don't know how or perhaps don't share that goal yet. You were speaking to having bought into the goal of flourishing, but there are businesses, there are organizations that aren't aware of this goal, that have more traditional goal sets. And you might even be a leader within one of those organizations, and you can see flourishing as the goal, but you have to somehow get everyone else on board. And I'm wondering, beyond how you would use the Canvas and the flourishing strategy design method with organizations and with stakeholders that have bought into the goal, what would you suggest as a path to get an organization on board as kind of like a low-level entry point to start using the Canvas and to start engaging with flourishing that also invites those that perhaps don't see this as a necessary or valuable goal yet?
So the first thing to say is that the ABCD method is useful whether or not you adopt the goal of flourishing. It's backcasting when it was originated was absolutely not for flourishing. As I mentioned, it was actually defined for the energy industry to better imagine its futures, which clearly weren't flourishing. So the next thing to say is that you need to educate people. So when we introduce the Flourishing Enterprise Strategy Design method to people in the step A, we will expose people, whether or not they have ever thought about it before, whether or not they want it or not, we'll expose people to something like Future Fitness, to give them, and we'll do other ways of exploring what that future society and economy and environment are going to be like. And we'll give people the choice. We'll say, you know, do any of these resonate with you? Which ones of these might you want to try and pursue now? And the answer could be none of them at all. And we'll also very often, even before we do business modeling, we'll actually start by talking about purpose. And we often use a tool by Simon Sinek, the Golden Circle, which asks the questions why, how, and what. And often that's very useful to do that work before you start working on the canvas, because it kind of frames up everything that you're going to put on your future canvas. So yeah, definitely meet people where they are. And I would say we don't have the practical experience of this yet, but as you go around the ABCD steps iteratively, so, you know, most organizations' planning cycles are somewhere between 2 and 5 years duration. So each iteration lasts 2 to 5 years. When you go round the iteration for a second time, you've learned a huge amount about all kinds of different things. And hopefully one of those things that you've learned something about is why flourishing is important. And, you know, if you imagine movements like the Flourishing Enterprise movement, of which we're all a part, is part of the process by which we hope to educate people about purposes that are more aligned with life.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anthony. That's great and very helpful. At this point, I want to ask if there are any other general questions to the presentation, but I just quickly wanted to share in the chat, and I'll do that now again, the 3 prompts that I mentioned before. So for those that maybe don't have a general question right now, I'd like to encourage each of you to at least think of one point about what surprised you about the presentation, something that perhaps disrupted you or was reinforced, was disrupted or reinforced for you, or perhaps how you would like to challenge what you heard. Because we have another about maybe 10 minutes for just our engagement and discussion. So please think about some thoughts maybe you had throughout the presentation that you'd like to share with everyone.
And while everybody's thinking about those, Kai's asked a fantastic question. Yeah. So how did the artistic idea come about? So it came about because I was challenged on a couple of occasions by business people who said, I can't constrain my future by anything, by anybody, because it'll stop me from being innovative. And I thought to myself, that's not true. When it comes to art, it's the opposite. It's the creative, it's the constraints that enable you to be more creative. And so that's where it came from. It came from that point that somebody made to me once, and then thinking about other fields where constraints are a normal part of the process. And so the artistic domain was the one where it came up. I don't know if that's a good answer, Kai, but that's the answer I have for you.
No, that's excellent. I'm looking into using systematically art to conquer the improbable. I have a method lined up there. I'd be happy to chat.
Absolutely, love to.
Just say something that popped out to me was, I think during the ABC part, at the bottom of the circle, I think it said, well, something leadership. I'm not sure if it was flourishing leadership, but kind of, I guess, as a, you know, a priori, if that's the term, something that needs to be in place in order to get a flourishing approach to be used, perhaps.
So methods aren't used in isolation. Methods are always used in contexts, and the capabilities that an organization has when you first approach them with the idea of using this method to do their strategy, how well they do will depend absolutely on the questions of how good their leadership capabilities are at the moment. It'll depend on how well they know not only the Canvas but other tools as well. You know, the Canvas is just a tool. It's not a, you know, a panacea. It's not a universal hammer. Far from it. And so this is one of the reasons why I personally am engaged with the Flourishing Enterprise Institute, because the idea of strategic management innovations is absolutely about figuring out what are the other things that are also useful in addition to the Canvas. And then that's also why I'm involved in the Enterprise Evolution program, because the Enterprise Evolution program is contextualizing this method and this tool with questions about leadership from a systems perspective, with how do you move people's mindsets towards to a place where they've got the capabilities to actually realize flourishing over time. So that absolutely includes leadership. Randy, I've probably butchered my definition of enterprise evolution, but that's what I came up with in the moment. Does that help, Josh?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting anything, so that was excellent.
Okay, good. What else surprised people? Or what did I disrupt or reinforced for you? Or how would you challenge what you've heard from me?
I'm a little bit curious, Anthony. Just in terms of your overall experience, I've been with the Canvas, or at kind of scaling the adoption of the Canvas for such a long time. Based on your own perceptions, what is the primary value that people get from using it? And I'm thinking more about the system actors that are bringing it to audiences that are keen to kind of program and enable. I imagine there's maybe a different reason why people show up in the first place and take an interest. But I imagine as well, through your follow-up conversations and meetings and the feedback provided, there's probably a couple of key benefits that kind of rise to the top in terms of the immediate use. And I mean, I also appreciate that when you have a sophisticated innovation like the Canvas, people aren't using it to its full capacity as a starting point. So I imagine that's also influencing what those benefits are. Could you speak a little bit to it?
Absolutely. I'll pick up on the first point you made, which is, you know, why do people come to the Canvas in the first place? And it's why people were attracted to the business model Canvas originally as well, which is people know that business models are really, really important to the success of their organization. We know that product and service innovation by itself is not sufficient in order to have a viable business. You actually have to have a viable business model to take those products and services to market. So that's the first thing that very often brings people into a workshop with, or attracts people that go, I've got to have a viable business model, and I want to have a tool that makes me think about the environment, society, and the economy, not just the economic dimension. So that's one big initial attraction. In terms of the value that they get out of it over the in the sort of short to medium term, I would say that it's almost always the better conversations that they have with the other people with whom they're using the Canvas. So if you imagine you're responding to a question, who are my stakeholders? And you've got 3 senior leaders around the Canvas working on this together, they actually have to negotiate with each other what they write on those sticky notes. So it builds shared understanding in a way that doesn't happen otherwise. And very often, you know, we run workshops where the senior leaders have discovered that they don't have a shared understanding of some basic things in their business. And that has often led to some quick wins in terms of things that they can do to improve the business in the near term, to take advantage of the fact that they now have alignment that they didn't have before. In the longer term, for those organizations, and I'd say we don't have too many of these yet at all, but in the longer term, what we're anticipating is that people find the value in the iterations. So, and in the validation work that you do. So once you come up with your design, you try and validate it as best you can. Even in the far future, you can try and do validation using foresight techniques and other things. The idea that you have a record of what your business model, what you're trying to move your business towards, means you've got a tool that you can use to communicate with all of your stakeholders about your intentions. And it means that you've got a baseline from which you can make plans that you don't have otherwise. And I think in the longer term, that's going to be a value that people get out of it. Steph, you
Thanks,
have
Anthony. Yeah, I was going to say, perfect.
Steph, you had your hand up. Do you have a question or an observation?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I was deep like staring at my screen at some of the visuals that you put up. I think I've seen this presentation when Peter delivered it a long time ago in SFI. So I think I was most surprised and excited to kind of see the startups method and the inclusion of like somatic practices and creating responsible spaces. And I'm curious on how can you replicate what I think are so vital in the enterprise process around creating responsible spaces, because some of the challenges that I've seen with working with large enterprise is getting them to prioritize those methods, as well as they take that first step into their journey, letting go of current practices and letting go of some of their kind of business as usual practices. And I think the somatic work really helps with that.
Thank you for that. I couldn't agree with you more. And I would say Stephen Davies and I are starting to think about what we want to put into the next iteration of the method, and what you've just described is absolutely absolutely key. I'm getting that alert too. Hold on a second.
Same one.
I think it probably went off for everybody. So it is a gap. It's a gap we recognize, and we absolutely need to include those things. I think the reason it didn't occur to us originally to put those things in was we were very focused on the, I don't want to say practical, on the obvious steps that you need to take and differentiating it from forecasting. And we didn't want to make it overly complex. I think it's already, you know, sophisticated and complex already. So adding and you can see with the Flourishing Startup method, we have a challenge even representing it visually in a way that actually conveys what it is. I think that's another challenge that we still have when we come to revisit it. What do we do about that? I mean, in our workshops, we do start to bring some of these ideas in, but as you know, there's a lot of resistance to these ideas, and people don't recognize them. With startups, with entrepreneurs, it's a lot easier to get them to pay attention to the inner and the outer journeys. Great question. Thank you, Steph.
Well, thanks so much, Anthony. I think we're almost at the end of time and still have a little bit of information to share. So I just at this point would like to thank you very much for your presentation today, for your time and all the discussion we've engaged in. Yes, please.
So I have some invitations I'd like to make to everybody just before I close. So it's like three, 4 slides. So let me just share my screen again. Where's sharing gone? Here it is. I think this presentation will be shared afterwards. So if you don't get the links that I'm going to mention down in here, you can. So first invitation is read the book chapter, and it's available for purchase. If you have challenges with buying it, then the normal online ways of going around the paywalls is available for this chapter. It's definitely out there. Our invitation is to ask you to consider how you might help your existing clients redesign their strategy to go beyond sustainability to flourishing. And I'd love you to contact me, and we could talk about how we could help, how we could collaborate to do that with your existing clients or new ones. Second invitation is on the Flourishing Startup method. There's a 90-minute introduction that Undine Hogeboom, the originator of the method, does every month except over the summer, and the details for that are at that bit.ly link. On page 3, you'll find the links to register for the, I think, May 21. May 21 is the next one, and then there's the next one will be in September. So you can sign up for that. And so the question we'd like you to consider here is, how might this help your startup or entrepreneurial clients, or clients who advise startups to make material progress towards improving their future fitness, towards flourishing. I think this is the last invitation. You should join our community. This is where you can get help using the Canvas. You can be part of this planetary-wide peer community of change makers who is focused on the Canvas and the rest of the toolkit. Opportunity to meet new like-minded people, get results using the tools by getting through the help that you can get, and there's exclusive content available as well when you become a member. And last but not least, I'd like to invite you to the next event of the Flourishing Business Community, which is on June the 11th at 1500 UTC. The amazing Anouk Natalia Willie is going to be talking about her work using the Canvas as an entrepreneur, but specifically an entrepreneur who's also an artist. So bringing that unique perspective to it, and the registration link is down at the bottom there on the screen. And that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anthony. Great presentation. As always, I've heard you speak a couple of times now, but there's always something new that I take away. So thanks so much for that, and thanks to everyone for your engagement in the discussion. We are at 1 p.m. now, so of course, if you have to leave for other appointments, that's totally fine. We'll still, I think, give our FEI updates that are super brief to give that time to Randy. So I'll just share my screen again, Randy, and we can do the last 5 minutes a little bit over time. So give me 1 second. Here we go. Randy, please, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. I'll be pretty brief. And of course, if anybody has questions about these updates, you can reach out to us individually, or we'll stay on for a few minutes afterwards. So in case you missed it, last month, our cafe session was focused on the research that the FEI has been doing on the work done with the City of Kitchener, applying the Enterprise Evolution Program. If you missed the session, our research team shared updates on that research, and many of the insights had a really good conversation. Anyway, I won't go into more, but it's all available on our website if you click on the cafe tab at the top. If you're interested in more on that process, the work with the City of Kitchener, applying Enterprise Evolution, I'll be participating in a session hosted by the UNDP next week, where I'll be in conversation with Dan Chapman, the CAO, the Chief Administrative Officer or City Manager of the City of Kitchener, talking about a little bit about the experience. We're sharing the stage with a bunch of different people. So it's only about a 15 or 20-minute conversation, but still really interesting in that this will be the first time we've had the chance to engage with Dan in a public forum like this, where he gets to speak personally about the experience from his perspective. We also have made some strides in this arena that we've been exploring along with R3.0 around context-based sustainability. And so what I'll share is we've been working on applying context-based sustainability with the city of Nanaimo for the past 1.5 years or so. The results are in. They've developed a monitoring strategy around their 20-year community plan. Really, really exciting, transformative stuff. If you have any interest in the SDGs or the donut economics model, I guess what I would say in summary is those solutions are brilliant principally as macro level innovations. They're not very useful at an enterprise scale. And I would say the complexity involved in navigating towards thresholds as an organization is essentially a lot greater than I think the thresholds at a macro scale, and navigating it isn't the kind of thing that most leaders can figure out off the side of their desk or while they're applying a new model like that in practice. Context-based sustainability represents a transformative solution that is applicable and adequately sophisticated for that complexity. And we've already learned a ton through the experience of applying it with the city of Nanaimo. We recently launched a community of practice interested in this field of work. And if you're interested in learning more, there'll probably be some updates in the coming weeks. You'll see posts from us on the Nanaimo work, and we'll probably have a session at some point soon dedicated to the topic. Feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in joining the community of practice or learning more about the work. And lastly, a couple of upcoming events. Some of you may be familiar with our work in the municipal space. FEI has co-founded the Municipalities Adapting in Response to Complexity Partnership. So we'll be presenting on our work with the City of Kitchener and Nanaimo, as well as some of the papers that we've written at the ICLEI World Congress in Sao Paulo, Brazil in June. And upcoming following that is the Innovate for Cities event hosted by the Global Covenant of Mayors, which will be hosted for the first time in person in Montreal in September. We've applied for some exciting new grants that will support us doing related research and growing and convening this community of practice around the Municipalities Adapting in Response to Complexity Partnership. So really excited about all of it. I appreciate I'm sharing quite rapidly and without really going into the details of each of these initiatives. So apologies if you're new to the organization or this is the first time you've heard about these initiatives. Again, there's more information on our website. You can reach out to us if you're interested in any of these topics or learning more. Can we jump to the next slide, Tim? Excellent. In case you're interested in the next couple of cafes, we've got them lined up on the 19th. We have a cafe featuring Sandra Waddock, who has been leading the Bounce Beyond project that has been mentioned in previous cafes. She's an exceptional leader and academic. She'll be in conversation with our director of research, Peter Jones. Should be a really interesting session in case you're interested. And then, as I mentioned, in response to Anthony's presentation earlier on, we're hosting Evolute 6 in July for the second cafe further out. And we'll be talking a little bit about their methodological approach and some of the insights they're developing in thinking about how we can get collectives or clusters of organizations working collaboratively. I'll stop it there and pass back to you, Tim. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Randy. That takes us pretty much to the end of our event today. I just wanted to say, and not just rhyming off what's on the screen here, this community is your community, and we're all always here. So please reach out with whatever you might be interested in. We love chatting about all this stuff. So even if you just have a thought and want to share it, you know, there's no barrier at all. Just feel free to reach out if it's any idea for collaboration, research, or in any way that you're interested in participating in the FEI. We'd love to hear from you. And that concludes our meeting for today. So all I'm left with is saying thank you to all of you for being here. Really hope to see you again next month and perhaps hear from you in between. Take care and bye for today.
Tim?